war is usually remembered through bullets, bombs, and body counts. But some of the most decisive victories in modern history were achieved without massive firepower, airstrikes, or conventional battles. Instead, they were won inside the human mind. Fear, belief, and perception became weapons more powerful than rifles. One of the most unusual examples of this occurred not in Europe or the Middle East, but deep in the jungles of the Philippines during the early Cold War. In the late 1940s and early 1950s, the United States faced a growing global threat, communist insurgencies spreading across Asia. After World War II, former colonies were unstable, governments were fragile, and armed rebel movements exploited poverty and resentment. The Philippines, newly independent from the United States, became one of the first Cold War battlegrounds in Southeast Asia. The center of this conflict was a guerrilla force known as the Hukbalahap, commonly shortened to the Hooks. Originally formed to resist Japanese occupation during World War II, the Hooks later turned their weapons against the Philippine government. By the early 1950s, they controlled large rural areas, especially in Luzon, and enjoyed support from local villagers who distrusted the state. The Philippine Army struggled to defeat them. Traditional military operations failed repeatedly. Every time troops cleared an area, the guerrillas vanished into the jungle, only to return weeks later. Firepower alone was not enough. The battlefield demanded a different strategy, one that targeted belief systems instead of enemy positions. This was where American military advisors entered the picture, working closely with the Philippine Army. Among them was a man who would later become legendary in the world of psychological operations, Edward Lansdale. Lansdale understood something many commanders ignored: rural insurgencies were not defeated solely by killing fighters. They were defeated by breaking morale, undermining myths, and separating rebels from the population that supported them. And in the Philippines, myth and superstition still had tremendous power. In many rural Filipino communities, belief in supernatural creatures was deeply ingrained. Stories of the aswang, a vampire-like monster said to stalk villages at night, were widely feared. These creatures were believed to drain blood, kill silently, and disappear into the darkness. For centuries, such folklore shaped behavior, fear, and decision-making. Rather than dismiss these beliefs as primitive, Lansdale and his team saw an opportunity. Instead of fighting the Hooks directly in large engagements, they decided to weaponize fear itself. The goal was not to kill insurgents, but to convince them they were no longer safe anywhere, even in the jungle at night. If the rebels believed something unnatural was hunting them, their confidence would collapse. The operation was deceptively simple. Intelligence units spread carefully planted rumors among villagers that a supernatural creature was roaming certain areas known to shelter Hook fighters. Whisper campaigns suggested that those who ventured out at night were disappearing, drained of blood, their bodies left behind with mysterious marks on their necks. Then came the psychological climax. A captured Hook guerrilla was killed in a manner designed to imitate vampire folklore. His body was quietly placed on a jungle trail used by other fighters. 2 puncture wounds were made on his neck, and the body was drained of blood. There were no gunshots, no signs of a conventional attack, only a corpse that perfectly matched the legends people already feared. When Hook patrols discovered the body, panic spread rapidly. Fighters refused to travel at night. Entire units abandoned jungle camps believed to be cursed. Some guerrillas deserted altogether, convinced they were being hunted by something beyond human control. What made the operation effective was not violence, but plausibility. The psychological operation worked because it aligned with existing cultural beliefs. The U.S. advisors did not invent fear, they amplified what already existed. This was psychological warfare at its most precise. No propaganda posters. No radio broadcasts. Just a carefully engineered narrative placed into a receptive environment. Over time, the Hook insurgency weakened. Combined with political reforms, anti-corruption efforts, and improved treatment of civilians, the rebellion collapsed. By the mid-1950s, the movement was effectively defeated. This vampire operation was never officially advertised. It remained buried in memoirs, declassified documents, and oral histories. But it became a foundational case study in modern psychological warfare, taught quietly in military academies and intelligence circles. The lesson was clear: wars are not won only by destroying enemies, but by controlling stories, symbols, and fear, and this would not be the last time the United States experimented with psychological warfare that blurred the line between reality and belief. In the decades that followed, similar strategies would appear in Vietnam, Latin America, and beyond, each adapted to local culture, myth, and perception. The success of the so-called vampire operation in the Philippines did not remain an isolated incident. Inside U.S. military and intelligence circles, it became proof of a powerful idea: belief itself could be weaponized. If fear could break an insurgency without major combat, then psychological warfare was not a secondary tactic, it was a primary strategy. By the mid-1950s, American military planners were deeply invested in studying the Philippine counterinsurgency campaign. Reports circulated through intelligence schools and advisory units, emphasizing one critical lesson: cultural understanding was as important as weapons training. Victory depended on knowing how people thought, what they feared, and what they believed. This philosophy would soon be tested on a much larger and far more complex battlefield. As the Cold War intensified, Southeast Asia became a focal point of global tension. Communist movements were gaining momentum, and U.S. policymakers feared a domino effect. When conflict escalated in Vietnam, many of the same psychological warfare concepts were quietly transferred there, along with some of the same people. One of them was again Edward Lansdale, now advising during the early stages of American involvement in Vietnam. While the environment was different, the principle remained the same: insurgencies survive on perception. If rebels appear inevitable, unstoppable, or protected by destiny, they gain power far beyond their actual numbers. In Vietnam, psychological operations expanded dramatically. Leaflets were dropped from aircraft. Radio broadcasts targeted enemy morale. Fake orders were planted. Rumors were deliberately spread to create confusion and distrust within guerrilla ranks. The goal was not just to frighten, but to destabilize identity and certainty. One infamous example involved exploiting spiritual beliefs surrounding death and the afterlife. In certain rural areas, there was a widespread belief that improper burial condemned the soul to wander eternally. Psychological units broadcast eerie sounds at night, moaning voices meant to represent restless spirits. The message was subtle but devastating: dying here would not bring peace. These operations echoed the logic of the earlier vampire strategy. The military was not inventing new fears, it was activating existing ones. By this point, psychological warfare had become institutionalized. The U.S. Army formally expanded its psychological operations units, integrating them into planning at every level of conflict. PSYOPs were no longer experimental, they were doctrine. But there was a darker side to this evolution. As psychological warfare grew more sophisticated, it also became easier to misuse. Manipulating belief systems could blur ethical boundaries, especially when civilian populations were involved. Fear, once unleashed, was difficult to control. A rumor could spread faster than intended. Panic could harm innocents as easily as insurgents. Even within military circles, debates emerged. Was it acceptable to exploit superstition? Where was the line between strategic deception and moral violation? These questions had no simple answers, and they remain unresolved to this day. What was undeniable, however, was effectiveness. Studies conducted after conflicts consistently showed that insurgent morale collapsed faster when psychological pressure was applied alongside limited force. Fighters deserted. Villagers withdrew support. Leaders lost authority. In many cases, battles never happened because the enemy chose not to fight. This realization reshaped counterinsurgency theory worldwide. Psychological warfare was no longer seen as manipulation, it was seen as influence. Control the narrative, and you control the battlefield. By the late 20th century, these ideas spread beyond the military. Intelligence agencies, political strategists, and even advertising industries adopted similar principles. Messaging, repetition, symbolism, and emotional triggers became tools of influence across society. In modern warfare, the concept has evolved even further. Today, psychological operations are no longer limited to leaflets and loudspeakers. Social media, digital propaganda, and information warfare have turned entire populations into battlefields. Fear spreads globally in seconds. Belief systems are shaped by algorithms rather than whispers in a village, yet the foundation remains the same as it was in the jungles of the Philippines. Human beings do not respond to facts alone. They respond to stories, to symbols, to fear of the unknown. The vampire operation stands as an early example of this truth, a moment when a military recognized that the most powerful weapon was not technological superiority, but psychological insight. It also serves as a warning: when fear becomes a tool of policy, it does not disappear when the war ends. The techniques perfected against insurgents can be turned inward, outward, or anywhere power seeks control. Psychological warfare leaves no ruins, but it reshapes minds, and that makes it one of the most dangerous weapons ever created. The jungle went quiet long ago. The guerrilla camps disappeared. The Cold War officially ended. But the methods perfected in those early psychological operations never vanished. They evolved. They adapted. And today, they surround us. Modern warfare is no longer confined to borders, uniforms, or battlefields. It exists in timelines, comment sections, trending hashtags, and viral videos. The same principles used to frighten insurgents in the Philippine jungle now operate on a global scale, faster, quieter, and far more efficiently. The core idea has never changed: control perception, and you control behavior. In the 21st century, psychological warfare no longer requires leaflets or loudspeakers. Digital platforms do the work automatically. Algorithms amplify emotion. Fear spreads faster than facts. Anger outperforms nuance. And belief, once again, becomes a weapon. Military strategists openly acknowledge this shift. Modern doctrine recognizes information warfare as a central pillar of conflict, alongside land, sea, air, space, and cyber domains. Nations now compete not just for territory, but for attention, trust, and narrative dominance. Unlike traditional wars, this battlefield has no front line. Every phone screen is a potential target. Every user is both consumer and distributor. The distinction between civilian and combatant blurs, not by force, but by influence. Psychological operations today are designed to feel organic. Messages are rarely labeled. Campaigns hide behind memes, influencers, anonymous accounts, and emotionally charged content. The goal is not to convince everyone, but to divide, exhaust, and destabilize. This mirrors the logic of earlier operations. Just as the vampire strategy succeeded by activating existing superstition, modern influence campaigns exploit existing fears: economic anxiety, identity conflict, mistrust of institutions, and fear of the unknown. No new terror is required. Only amplification. What makes this era uniquely dangerous is scale. A rumor that once spread village by village can now reach millions in minutes. A carefully framed narrative can influence elections, fuel unrest, or undermine public trust without firing a single shot. The cost is low. The impact is enormous. Psychological warfare has become permanent, and unlike bombs, it leaves no visible destruction, only fractured societies and confused realities. Former intelligence analysts often describe modern influence operations as slow corrosion. Instead of shocking populations, they gradually erode certainty. People no longer know what to trust. Every source feels compromised. Truth becomes subjective. Exhaustion replaces outrage. This state of confusion is not accidental. It is strategically valuable. When people are overwhelmed, they disengage. When they distrust everything, they resist nothing. A population locked in emotional reaction is easier to influence than one grounded in critical thinking. The lesson from the Philippine jungle echoes clearly here: fear does not need to be constant. It only needs to be present enough to shape behavior, and this is where the ethical dilemma returns, stronger than ever. If psychological warfare is now embedded in everyday information systems, how does a society defend itself? Traditional defenses, walls, armies, weapons, are useless against ideas. Censorship often backfires. Silence allows manipulation to spread unchecked. The only real defense is awareness. Understanding that influence exists does not make someone immune, but it makes them harder to manipulate. Psychological warfare depends on invisibility. Once exposed, its power weakens. This is why historical examples matter. The vampire operation was effective not because it was supernatural, but because it was human. It worked because it understood fear, belief, and context. Those same human traits still define us today. Technology has changed the delivery system. It has not changed the target. The mind remains the battlefield, and unlike past wars, this one has no clear ending. There will be no surrender documents. No victory parades. Influence campaigns do not stop when treaties are signed. They persist as long as attention exists. This reality places responsibility not just on governments or institutions, but on individuals. Every share, every reaction, every moment of outrage feeds the system. Awareness slows it. Skepticism disrupts it. Critical thinking weakens it. The final lesson of psychological warfare is not about manipulation, but vulnerability. Humans seek meaning. We fear uncertainty. We cling to stories that explain chaos. These instincts make civilization possible, and exploitation inevitable. The same tools that once emptied jungle camps now shape global conversations, and the question is no longer whether psychological warfare exists. The question is whether we recognize it, before it recognizes us.